The rain comes down in thin, cold lines over lower Manhattan, blurring the outlines of the federal courthouse and the television cameras clustered at its steps. It is the mid-1990s, and New York City is trying very hard to convince the world that the era of the old-style crime families is over. Inside, federal prosecutors flip through binders thick with surveillance notes, wiretap transcripts, and the dry language of racketeering statutes. Outside, reporters rehearse their stand-ups, crafting a story that will fit neatly into a 2-minute news segment. Another alleged mafia boss, another indictment, another attempt by the government to break a way of life that has burrowed into the city for generations. When the U.S. Marshals bring Liborio Bellomo into view, he does not look like the cinematic version of a gangland boss. No sweeping coat, no spectacle. Just a compact, dark-haired man in a plain suit, cuffed at the wrists, jaw set, face unreadable as camera shutters snap. For federal agents who have spent years tracking him, he is not just another defendant. He is, according to their affidavits, a key node in the most secretive of New York's criminal organizations, the Genovese crime family. For his lawyers, he is a man the government has decided to cast in a leading role in its ongoing campaign against organized crime. For the public, his name barely registers. The mystique of the mafia has faded, and the players now look more like white-collar defendants than underworld legends. But the scene at the courthouse is the end of a long chain of events that began far from the television lights, in a different New York City entirely. To understand how a quiet, relatively unknown figure like Liborio Bellomo came to be described in federal papers as a leader of a powerful criminal network, we have to step back in time, to the years when the city's Italian neighborhoods were still crowded with first- and second-generation immigrants, when the word mafia was something people said in a low voice, if they said it at all, and when the street where a boy was born could shape the course of his life more than any official institution. Archival black and white footage fills the screen. Narrow East Harlem streets in the 1950s, pushcarts and corner groceries, laundry strung between walk-ups, elderly men in flat caps chatting on stoops. Somewhere in this dense grid of tenements and storefronts, on January 8, 1957, public records tell us that a boy named Liborio Bellomo was born in New York City, into an Italian-American family whose daily life would have been familiar to thousands of others in the neighborhood. The world would come to know him by his nickname, Barney, but at the moment of his birth, he was simply another child in a community built on the promises and frustrations of the immigrant experience. Italian Harlem, once one of the largest Italian enclaves in the United States, had been a landing place for migrants from southern Italy since the late 19th century. Families crowded into railroad apartments, worked long hours in factories, shops, or the informal economy, and clung to the institutions that gave them a sense of continuity. The parish church, the neighborhood social clubs, the small businesses where the Italian language still flowed easily. By the mid-1950s, though, that world was already beginning to change. Post-war prosperity was pulling many families outward, toward the suburbs and the outer boroughs. New groups were moving into East Harlem, and hovering over these everyday transitions was something few would talk about directly but almost everyone knew existed: the quiet, coercive influence of organized crime. On Pleasant Avenue and the blocks that fed into it, that influence was especially strong. Long before Bellomo was born, East Harlem had been the base for what law enforcement would later call the 116th Street Crew, a local unit affiliated with the larger Genovese crime family. Men like Michael "Trigger" Mike Coppola in earlier decades, and later Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, had turned neighborhood vices, numbers gambling, loan sharking, and other rackets, into steady revenue streams. Their presence was felt in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable: who could safely open a business, who owed money to whom, which corners were spoken for, which disputes mysteriously resolved themselves with a few quiet conversations in a back room. For a child growing up in that environment, organized crime was not necessarily an abstract concept. It was part of the landscape. It might be the men who always seemed to be at a particular cafe, the unexplained respect shown to certain older figures, or the hushed way adults changed the subject when particular names came up. At the same time, it is important to be clear. Most residents of East Harlem were not gangsters, and they did not want to be. They were machinists, tailors, homemakers, laborers, small shopkeepers trying to improve their lot. Yet the shadow cast by the crews who operated in the area was real, and for a small number of young men, that shadow would one day become the path they followed. Of Bellomo's private childhood, his schooling, his friendships, his day-to-day family life, relatively little has been made public in court records or investigative reporting. He has granted no sweeping interviews about his early years, and those who knew him best have not stepped forward on camera to reminisce. That silence is, in itself, a reflection of the culture of secrecy that surrounded the organizations he would later be linked to. But even without those personal recollections, the broader forces shaping his formative years are well documented, and they help explain the world in which his name would first come to the attention of law enforcement. In November 1957, when Bellomo was still an infant, a meeting of major American and foreign crime figures in rural Appalachian, New York, was raided by state police. That raid, and the images of well-dressed men fleeing through the woods, forced federal authorities to acknowledge publicly that a national network of organized crime, what some insiders called Cosa Nostra, existed. The Genovese family, with roots in the very neighborhoods where Bellomo grew up, was one of the key organizations identified by investigators in the aftermath. From that point on, the invisible world that had shaped East Harlem for decades became the subject of a sustained campaign by federal law enforcement. The passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, in 1970, when Bellomo was about 13 years old, would prove particularly significant. RICO allowed prosecutors to target the leadership of criminal organizations by tying them to a pattern of offenses committed by their subordinates, even if they did not personally carry out specific crimes. Throughout the 1970s, FBI agents and prosecutors in New York began using this tool, along with informants and wiretaps, to reach higher up in the hierarchies of the city's 5 main Italian-American crime families: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. For the older generation of bosses and capos, this meant a new level of risk and scrutiny. For the younger men coming of age in the neighborhoods, it meant entering a world already under siege, where long-standing practices were suddenly much more likely to end in long prison sentences. Meanwhile, the city itself was changing in ways that would have been impossible to ignore. The 1960s and 1970s saw rising crime rates, a manufacturing decline, racial tension, and bitter political debates over housing, policing, and education. East Harlem was at the intersection of many of these shifts. As Italian families moved out, Puerto Rican and African American residents moved in, bringing their own cultures and struggles. Some of the old Italian institutions adapted, others withered. The strong, almost village-like atmosphere of the early immigrant years loosened, but the networks built up by the local criminal crews did not simply vanish. They adjusted, extended their reach into new types of schemes, and maintained their grip on certain unions, businesses, and rackets. It was in this mixture of economic uncertainty, neighborhood change, and entrenched underworld power that Liborio Bellomo grew from a child into a young man. Publicly available law enforcement records begin to treat him as a figure of interest by the late 1970s and early 1980s, not as a major leader, but as part of the Genovese family's East Harlem and Bronx axis. That arc, from a boy in a tenement to a name in an FBI file, was not unique in his generation. There were well-worn pathways by which young men were drawn into the orbit of the local crew, working in or around social clubs, running small errands for older men, being introduced by a relative or a neighbor with influence, or simply showing a willingness to remain silent and loyal when questioned. Investigators and former insiders who later cooperated with the government have described, in general terms, the way a neighborhood could function as an informal recruitment pool. A teenager who grew up seeing certain men treated as authority figures, who watched them hand out small favors, jobs on a construction site, a loan when money was tight, help smoothing over a problem with a landlord, might come to see their world as both dangerous and alluring. It offered a kind of power very different from the official institutions that often seemed distant or unresponsive. None of that suggests inevitability. Thousands of young people raised in similar circumstances chose other paths. But it does help explain why, when law enforcement later mapped the social networks of the Genovese family, there was a heavy concentration of names tied to just a few streets. By the time Bellomo was entering adulthood, the Genovese organization itself was undergoing a transition. Vito Genovese, the family's namesake, had died in federal custody in 1969. Control had passed through various hands, including those of Philip Lombardo, a notoriously low-profile boss, and Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, the East Harlem-based figure who would later be publicly identified as a top leader during the famous commission trial of the 1980s. Behind the scenes, according to later federal charges and testimony, Vincent Chin, Gigant emerged as a powerful and secretive force within the family, cultivating the image of a mentally unstable recluse. Even as prosecutors claimed, he directed a far-reaching criminal enterprise. Within that structure, the 116th Street crew, Salerno's old base in East Harlem, remained a critical component. It had long been involved in gambling and loan sharking, but over time it also extended influence into labor unions, construction, and other sectors, often through intimidation that stopped short of open violence but relied on the fear of what might happen to anyone who refused to cooperate. It was into this specific, tightly controlled unit that law enforcement would eventually place Liborio Bellomo. By the early 1980s, agents monitoring the Genovese family's activities began encountering his name more often, usually in connection with figures they already saw as established players in the 116th Street sphere. To the outside observer, those years in Bellomo's life are mostly a patchwork, reconstructed from surveillance reports, wiretaps, and the testimony of others. They suggest a trajectory from an associate, a man trusted with small but important tasks, toward a more central role. His reputation inside the organization, as filtered through later court documents, was of someone who knew how to operate quietly, to maintain discipline, and to avoid the kind of flamboyance that had drawn so much attention to earlier generations of mob leaders. In a period when law enforcement pressure was mounting, those qualities were valued. But they also meant that little personal detail about him leaked out. He was, by design, not a public figure. As his standing in the 116th Street orbit rose, another story was unfolding in parallel. The federal government's increasing determination to dismantle the upper tiers of New York's crime families. The 1980s would bring a series of high-profile prosecutions, including the so-called commission case that targeted bosses and leaders from several families under RICO. Anthony Salerno, the East Harlem power whose career had shaped the crew that nurtured Bellomo's rise, received a lengthy prison sentence. For the Genovese family, this created both a crisis and an opportunity. The old guard was being removed, sometimes for life. Younger figures, hardened by years of operating under surveillance and aware of the new legal landscape, began to rise in their place. Liborio Bellomo was part of that younger generation. To federal agents tracking the Genovese network, he appeared as one of the men stepping into the void left by Salerno and others, particularly in matters connected to the 116th Street crew and its spheres of influence. To the communities his organization touched, his name may have meant little compared to the better-known bosses of earlier eras, but the decisions made in that inner circle had real consequences. for workers pushed into corrupt unions, for businesses pressured into paying protection, for neighborhoods where fear and silence allowed a small group to exercise outsized control. The boy born in East Harlem in 1957, into a world where organized crime was part of the neighborhood's unspoken reality, had grown into a man whose alleged role in that very underworld would draw the intense scrutiny of prosecutors and agents. The journey from one point to the other was not simply the story of a single individual's choices. It was also the story of a city's evolution, of the shifting balance between illegal power and legal authority, and of the way particular streets and social circles could channel a life toward conflict with the law. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, that conflict would come fully into the open, and Liborio Bellomo's name, once just another entry in an agent's notebook, would be written into some of the most significant federal cases in the long struggle between New York's crime families and the institutions determined to contain them. By the early 1980s, the narrow blocks of East Harlem where Liborio Bellomo had grown up were still dotted with the same small groceries and cafes, but the atmosphere had changed. The neighborhood was poorer than it had been in his childhood. Buildings were more run down, and longtime residents spoke about crime and drugs with a weariness that suggested they no longer believed anyone was coming to fix things. In that environment, the old neighborhood power structures, churches, political clubs, and the tight webs of extended family competed with, and were often overshadowed by, the quiet authority of the local crew connected to the Genovese crime family. This was the world in which Bellomo's name began to appear in FBI reports, not just as a face in a crowd, but as someone to watch. By then in his 20s, he was no longer simply a young man from Pleasant Avenue. In the eyes of law enforcement, he was an associate of the 116th Street crew, the East Harlem branch of the Genovese organization that had grown under men like Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno. In the internal language of that underworld, an associate meant someone who worked with the group, earned money with them, and took directions, but who had not yet been formally inducted as a full member. The process by which someone crossed that line from associate to full member, what insiders called being made, was, by design, hidden from public view. But over the years, through informant testimony and court cases, its broad outlines became known. It was not simply a matter of filling out a form. It was an invitation extended only after years of observation, when older figures were convinced of a candidate's loyalty, discretion, and capacity to bring in money. At some point in the early 1980s, federal investigators came to believe that Liborio Bellomo crossed that line, joining the tightly controlled circle of sworn members of the Genovese family. The exact date and the specific ceremony will likely never be documented in a way historians can verify definitively. But by the mid-1980s, internal FBI charts of the family's structure placed him not at the bottom, but among the recognized soldiers of the 116th Street crew. Soldiers in the traditional hierarchy reported up to a caporgine, a capo, who oversaw a unit of men tied to a specific neighborhood or set of rackets. For decades in East Harlem, Anthony Salerno had been that figure, outwardly a cigar-chewing bookmaker who held court in a modest social club, but in prosecutors' eyes, a powerful organizer of gambling and loan sharking, and eventually, top leader of the entire Genovese family. Yet even as Salerno's public profile rose, another man, Vincent Chin Gigant, was steadily consolidating control behind the scenes, cultivating the bizarre public image of an unstable recluse to deflect scrutiny. Salerno, as later testimony and documents suggested, functioned at least in part as a decoy boss, drawing investigators' attention while Gigant tried to manage the family from the shadows. For rank-and-file members like Bellomo, that high-level drama did not necessarily change the basic routines of their lives. They collected cash from gambling operations, saw to it that debts were paid, enforced the family's decisions about who could operate where, and helped maintain the network of corruption that reached into unions and businesses. But the 1980s brought an increasing sense that something was shifting. The passage of RICO and the new determination of federal prosecutors to use it meant that the kind of activity that had once resulted in a few years behind bars could now add up to decades if it could be tied into a larger conspiracy. The turning point came into sharp focus in 1985, when federal agents arrested Salerno and other high-ranking figures in what would become known as the Commission case. For the first time, prosecutors did not limit themselves to individual acts of gambling or extortion. They charged the leadership of several New York crime families with collectively running a criminal cartel that controlled key sectors of the city's economy. Among those industries was construction, a field in which the 116th Street crew had developed deep influence. Through control of unions, the threat of labor disruptions, and a web of personal relationships, organized crime figures were able to manipulate bids, inflate costs, and siphon off a portion of large contracts. The Commission trial ended in sweeping convictions and long sentences. Anthony Salerno was branded by the government as a top leader of the Genovese family and sent to prison for what amounted to the rest of his life. For outside observers, it looked as if the Genovese organization had suffered a devastating blow. Inside, however, the effect was more complicated. Gigant, who was also charged in other cases but spent years fighting over his fitness to stand trial, still exerted influence. And at the middle levels of the family, capos, soldiers, seasoned associates, the result of the crackdown was a gradual reshuffling rather than a collapse. It was during this reshuffling that Liborio Bellomo's stature appears to have risen dramatically. As Salerno's era ended, law enforcement intelligence reported that the 116th Street crew did not dissolve. Instead, its leadership was reconfigured. By the late 1980s, FBI agents and New York City detectives assigned to organized crime squads were describing Bellomo in internal documents as a key figure in that crew, first as a trusted soldier, and then, increasingly, as the man effectively running it. Surveillance reports described him frequenting social clubs and restaurants known to be gathering places for the Genovese membership, quietly meeting with men already identified as capos or senior advisors. The rackets associated with his name in later indictments were not glamorous. They included illegal gambling, sports betting, card games and numbers, run through back rooms and pay phones, loan sharking, where people short on money were advanced cash at extremely high interest rates under the threat of serious consequences if they failed to repay, and extortion of local businesses. A small construction company might find that getting work in a particular area required making regular payments to men tied to the crew. A bar owner who wanted to avoid trouble, from vandalism, from disruptive patrons no one else could seem to control, from sudden visits by inspectors, might be encouraged to pay for protection, a euphemism for buying peace from the very people who could disturb it. In many cases, violence did not have to be visible to be effective. The reputation of the organization, built over decades, did much of the work. When court documents later referred to threats of force, they often described situations in which the implicit possibility of harm, coupled with a reputation for following through, was enough to secure cooperation. For the communities where these practices took root, the effects were corrosive. Business owners who wanted no part of criminal activity found themselves doing mental calculations about the risks of saying no versus the cost of paying. Workers whose unions were influenced by the family found that decisions about contracts, benefits, and assignments could be shaped by considerations that had nothing to do with their welfare. As the 1980s closed, federal agencies redoubled their focus on the Genovese family, which despite the high-profile prosecutions was still viewed in law enforcement circles as the most disciplined and insulated of New York's traditional crime organizations. Where some families tolerated flamboyant behavior from their members, the Genovese leadership emphasized caution. No unnecessary attention, no public brawls, no flashy displays of wealth that might attract media interest. In that climate, someone like Bellomo, quiet, unassuming in public but reportedly effective in managing operations, fit well. By the early 1990s, prosecutors would later allege his responsibilities had outgrown the boundaries of a single crew. With Gigant striving to remain off-stage, the family relied on intermediaries sometimes described as street bosses or acting bosses to handle day-to-day decisions. These roles were unofficial in the sense that there were no public announcements, but they were real in terms of authority. In several indictments and affidavits, federal prosecutors identified Liborio Bellomo as one of these key figures, a man they claimed was helping to coordinate the family's activities across various crews and industries. This was not merely a matter of internal mafia politics. It had concrete impacts on labor markets and city budgets. The Genovese family, often in cooperation with other families, was accused of manipulating the awarding of contracts for public housing repairs, office building renovations, and other construction projects. By pressuring union officials and contractors, they could steer work to favored companies in exchange for hidden payments. The cost overruns on such projects, passed on to taxpayers and tenants, were an invisible tax imposed by organized crime. Federal investigators built their cases patiently. The lessons of earlier prosecutions had taught them that street arrests and visible raids might temporarily disrupt activities, but rarely dismantled the structure. They invested in long-term surveillance, hidden microphones in social clubs and restaurant back rooms, bugs in cars, wiretaps on telephone lines, and the cultivation of insiders willing to cooperate. Some of these insiders had once taken the same blood oaths as the men they now described in court. Facing long sentences, they chose to trade information for leniency. Through this slow accumulation of evidence, certain names surfaced repeatedly. Among them, according to later filings, was Liborio Bellomo. Agents recorded him in conversation with known capos, discussing money, disputes, and the need to maintain discipline. They followed him as he moved between East Harlem, the Bronx, and other parts of the city where Genovese influence was strong. They documented his presence at meetings that, in their view, demonstrated his supervisory role. For Bellomo, the increased attention was not entirely invisible. By the early 1990s, anyone in his world would have been aware that phones might be tapped and that any meeting place might be bugged. The older generation's confidence that secrecy alone could protect them had been shaken by the string of RICO successes. Some figures responded by withdrawing from direct contact with operations, relying on layers of intermediaries. Others, including members of the younger generation, tried to adapt by keeping conversations vague, using coded language, and avoiding explicit references to illegal acts. Yet in the end, the very existence of a sustained pattern of association, who met with whom, how often, and under what circumstances, became a key component of the government's cases. The first serious legal collisions between Bellomo and the federal government began to surface in this period. In the early 1990s, his name appeared in indictments that accused him of participating in racketeering enterprises tied to the Genovese family. These documents did not isolate a single alleged crime. Instead, they listed a series of acts: extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and related offenses, woven together under the RICO framework as parts of a broader criminal conspiracy. The message from prosecutors was clear. They saw him not as a minor figure, but as someone bearing responsibility for sustaining the ongoing operations of the organization. Court proceedings from those years, though often dry in language, convey the tension of the moment. When federal attorneys argued against bail for him or his co-defendants, they described the Genovese family as a highly structured and dangerous enterprise, and Bellomo as one of its important leaders. Defense lawyers pushed back, portraying him as a family man, a neighborhood figure whose supposed influence had been exaggerated by agents determined to make headlines in the long-running campaign against organized crime. In these hearings, the two competing narratives of his life came into sharp relief. On one side, the portrait of a quiet but powerful organizer within a criminal network. On the other, the argument that he was being swept up in a prosecutorial dragnet looking for big names. Behind the scenes, investigative teams continued to refine their understanding of the Genovese hierarchy. Each arrest, each flipped witness, yielded new fragments. Some cooperators identified Bellomo as the man who had taken over key responsibilities after Salerno's imprisonment, particularly in the East Harlem and Bronx rackets. Others placed him in meetings where disputes between crews were hashed out, or where the division of labor in corrupt union schemes was discussed. This information did not always come in cleanly. Memories were contested, motives questioned, and defense attorneys highlighted every inconsistency. Yet over time, a broad pattern emerged that reinforced the government's view of his role. By the mid-1990s, that pattern had solidified into a major federal case. Prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, drawing on years of surveillance and cooperation, prepared an indictment that would place Liborio Bellomo near the center of their narrative about the Genovese family's operations. They alleged that he had served as a powerful leader within the organization, directing and profiting from extortion schemes in the construction industry, overseeing illicit gambling, and enforcing the family's control over certain unions and businesses. They connected his name to violent acts carried out by subordinates, arguing under RICO that a leader bore responsibility for the foreseeable consequences of the enterprise he helped run. When agents finally moved to arrest him, it was the culmination of this long, methodical build-up. Early morning knock and announce raids, agents in windbreakers bearing the initials of their agencies, neighbors peeking through curtains. These were by now familiar images in New York's long history of organized crime crackdowns. For Bellomo, they marked a new stage in his life, from the relative invisibility of a man known mainly within a tight underworld circle to the publicity and pressure of a federal defendant, depicted as one of the key figures in what prosecutors still called, in formal language, an organized crime family. As he was brought in to face these charges, the contrasts that had defined his path stood in stark relief. The child of an immigrant enclave where power often accumulated outside official channels had grown into an adult whom federal authorities now accused of steering one of those very channels of unofficial power. The same streets that had offered limited, legitimate opportunities had also provided an apprenticeship in illicit ones. The question that would now move to the foreground, in courtrooms, in press coverage, and in the minds of the public, was how much responsibility Liborio Bellomo personally bore for the fear, corruption, and economic distortion attributed to the Genovese family, and how the legal system would measure and respond to that responsibility in the years to come. The day Liborio Bellomo was first brought into a packed federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan in the mid-1990s, the pace of his life abruptly shifted from the unhurried movements of backroom meetings and quiet neighborhood routines to the rigid schedule of the criminal justice system. Marshals led him through corridors he had not chosen, at times of day he did not set, into a room where the stakes were measured not in street reputation or underworld precedent, but in statutes and sentencing guidelines. The indictment that now bore his name was the product of years of work by agents and prosecutors. It did not describe a single isolated incident. Instead, it laid out, in the deliberate, unemotional language of federal law, an allegation that he and others had helped run an ongoing criminal enterprise, the Genovese family. At its core, the document charged him under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, with participating in a pattern of racketeering activity that stretched across years. The predicate acts listed were the kinds of schemes that had long been associated with the 116th Street crew and its allies: extortion of businesses and unions, illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, and related offenses that, taken together, formed the spine of the government's case. Prosecutors described Bellomo not as a marginal participant but as a leader. In press conferences and court filings, they called him a street boss, or acting boss, for the Genovese family, someone who helped translate decisions from the higher echelons, where Vincent Chin, Gigant, was alleged to preside, into concrete orders for soldiers and associates. Their narrative placed him at the center of efforts to maintain the family's influence in the construction industry, in particular through the manipulation of labor unions and contractors. The idea was not that he alone controlled these spheres, but that he was one of a small number of men who had the authority to coordinate, approve, or veto key moves. The charges related to the construction industry were especially significant because they illustrated how organized crime could affect people far beyond the neighborhoods where crews traditionally operated. For large building projects in New York, office towers, public housing renovations, commercial centers, contracts ran into the millions. According to the indictment, the Genovese family and its partners used a mixture of intimidation and corrupt relationships to steer some of that money into their own pockets. They were alleged to have interfered with bidding on contracts, ensured that certain union locals were friendly to their interests, and extracted regular payments from contractors in exchange for labor peace or access to certain markets. For example, prosecutors described arrangements in which a contractor seeking to win a lucrative job would quietly agree to pay a hidden fee or hire a subcontractor tied to the family. In return, they could expect that construction would proceed without disruptive strikes or slowdowns, and that union issues would resolve in their favor. Workers, tenants, and taxpayers, however, seldom benefited from these hidden agreements. Costs went up, corners could be cut, and honest firms found themselves at a disadvantage if they refused to participate. The indictment portrayed Bellomo as one of the men responsible for keeping these invisible mechanisms running, ensuring that the tax imposed by organized crime continued to flow. Alongside these accusations were more traditional allegations that he had overseen or sanctioned illegal gambling operations, where bets on sports, cards, and numbers were placed through networks of runners and bookmakers, that he had been involved in loan sharking schemes, in which individuals in financial distress were extended credit at exorbitant interest rates and faced escalating pressure if they fell behind, and that he had participated in extortion arrangements, or small businesses paid for protection they could not safely refuse. The indictment linked these activities to specific time periods and, in some instances, to particular co-defendants, weaving a picture of an interlocking system rather than discrete, unrelated crimes. From the outset, the defense contested this picture. In pre-trial filings and in front of the judge, Bellomo's lawyers argued that the government was relying too heavily on the words of informants trying to save themselves, on inferences drawn from who met with whom, and on the broad net of RICO to sweep ordinary social and business contacts into a criminal conspiracy. They emphasized that he had never sought the kind of attention that many earlier underworld figures had embraced. There were no tapes of him boasting to journalists, no photographs of him presiding over ostentatious gatherings. To his attorneys, that absence suggested not cunning, as the government claimed, but the possibility that his role had been inflated. The battle over whether he should await trial behind bars or be released on bail brought the two narratives into particularly sharp focus. Federal prosecutors urged the court to deny bail, arguing that, as an alleged high-ranking member of a powerful criminal organization, he posed both a danger to the community and a risk of flight. They pointed to the long potential sentence he faced under RICO, the Genovese family's demonstrated ability to assist members who wanted to go underground, and the history of obstruction and intimidation associated with organized crime. Defense counsel countered that he had strong family ties, that he had not fled when he first learned of the investigation, and that the government's characterizations of his role were just that, allegations, not yet proven. These hearings, while focused on technical questions of risk and conditions, also opened a window into how each side saw him. Prosecutors spoke of him as an essential node in a dangerous network, someone who could, with a word, influence whether a contractor's life was made easy or difficult, whether a union business agent felt free to act in the interests of workers or had to look over his shoulder. The defense painted a more ordinary picture, a middle-aged man with a limited formal education, the product of a neighborhood whose social fabric the government now seemed intent on criminalizing wholesale. For observers in the courtroom, the difficulty lay in reconciling these views, both of which had elements supported in the public record. His low public profile on one hand, the persistent references to him in law enforcement intelligence on the other. As the case moved toward trial, more details of the investigation became public through motions and evidentiary hearings. Agents testified about wiretaps and bugs placed in social clubs and restaurants associated with the Genovese family. While the content of many recordings remained under seal, enough emerged to show that the surveillance had been extensive and long-lasting. There were conversations in which coded language was used to discuss money, obligations, and disputes. There were references to friends in unions or on job sites. Occasionally, there were snippets that prosecutors argued showed deference to Bellomo's judgment or indicated that he had the authority to resolve conflicts. Cooperating witnesses, former associates, or even inducted members who chose to work with the government were another crucial component. They described meetings where, they said, Bellomo spoke as someone in command, deciding who would handle a particular operation, settling quarrels between subordinates, or relaying the preferences of higher-ups. Defense attorneys attacked these witnesses vigorously, highlighting their criminal histories, the deals they had struck, and the inconsistencies between different statements. The credibility of such cooperators had long been a central issue in organized crime prosecutions, and this case was no exception. Yet even with their flaws, their accounts often matched patterns already visible in surveillance and financial records. The legal complexities of RICO added another layer of nuance. Under the statute, the government did not need to prove that Bellomo personally committed each act listed as part of the racketeering pattern. It could be enough to show that he was part of an enterprise, and that the enterprise engaged in those acts in furtherance of its goals. That meant that evidence of extortion, gambling, and loan sharking anywhere within the Genovese structure during the period in question could potentially be used to support the case, so long as prosecutors could credibly link him to the leadership or management of that structure. Defense counsel warned that this approach risked blurring individual responsibility, punishing their client for the acts of others simply because of who he was alleged to be. Media coverage of the case, though less breathless than in the days when names like Gotti dominated headlines, reflected an enduring public fascination with organized crime. Newspapers and television reports regularly mentioned Bellomo alongside Vincent Gigant, describing them as central figures in what was often called America's most sophisticated mafia family. Yet the tone was changing. There was less romanticizing language, fewer casual references to honor or codes, and more emphasis on the economic damage done by construction fraud and labor racketeering. The city was in the midst of a widely publicized transformation, with crime rates falling and neighborhoods like Times Square being redeveloped. In that context, the case was framed as part of the effort to ensure that powerful, unaccountable groups could no longer quietly siphon off public and private funds. Faced with the weight of the evidence and the uncertainties of a full trial under RICO, Bellomo eventually chose to plead guilty to certain charges rather than contest every allegation before a jury. Court records show that he entered a plea to racketeering-related offenses that acknowledged his role in activities such as extortion and the manipulation of union influence in the construction industry. In doing so, he did not admit to every element of the government's original narrative, but he accepted responsibility for being part of an organized effort that used illegal means to control and profit from various economic sectors. At his sentencing, the judge was required to balance multiple factors: the seriousness of the crimes, his prior record, the need to deter both him and others, and any mitigating circumstances presented by the defense. Prosecutors argued for a significant term of imprisonment, emphasizing the long-lasting nature of the schemes and the broader harm caused by systematic corruption. Defense counsel pointed to his family obligations, the length of time he had already spent in custody, and the fact that he had chosen to resolve the case without forcing victims and witnesses through a prolonged trial. The result was a substantial prison sentence measured in years, not months, a consequence that reflected both the success of the RICO framework and the government's belief that only lengthy incarceration could disrupt the leadership of entrenched criminal organizations. For Liborio Bellomo, who had spent his adult life operating in a world where power often seemed to flow from informal arrangements rather than official titles, the transition to the highly structured environment of the federal prison system must have represented a profound shift, even if the details of his personal reaction remain known only to those closest to him. What is clear from the public record is that his conviction marked a significant milestone in the broader campaign against the Genovese family. Federal officials publicly highlighted the case as evidence that even the most secretive and disciplined of New York's crime groups could be penetrated, and its upper ranks held to account. They pointed to the disruption in the 116th Street Crew's traditional operations, the weakening of its grip on specific unions, and the deterrent message sent to younger associates who might have believed that staying in the shadows would shield them from serious consequences. Yet history also shows that such victories were seldom absolute. Organized crime groups, particularly those as entrenched as the Genovese family, had long demonstrated an ability to adapt to setbacks. When older leaders were incarcerated, new figures often emerged to fill the void, drawing on the same neighborhood ties and underground traditions that had sustained the organization for decades. Even as Bellomo began serving his sentence, investigators continued to watch for signs of reorganization, new alliances, and the quiet reassertion of familiar patterns. For the moment, though, his world had narrowed to the routines of federal custody: counts, meal times, limited visits, the distant echo of the city where he had once moved freely. The man once described by prosecutors as a key architect of under-the-table influence over multimillion-dollar construction projects was now an inmate identified by a Bureau of Prisons number. His case, preserved in court dockets, transcripts, and press clippings, had become part of the long and evolving history of New York's struggle with organized crime, a history in which his name would continue to appear, unexpectedly, even after this first major period of incarceration came to an end. When the cell doors closed behind Liborio Bellomo in the late 1990s, one story about his life seemed, from the outside, to have reached its conclusion. A man whom federal prosecutors had portrayed as a central organizer within the Genovese crime family was now another inmate in the federal system, subject to the same counts, searches, and institutional rules as thousands of others. Yet even as he settled into the routines of incarceration, his name did not disappear from law enforcement reports. Instead, it remained a kind of fixed point in the shifting map of New York's underworld, a reminder that leadership in organized crime could persist in more diffuse, less visible forms. The sentence imposed after his racketeering plea was substantial, intended to sideline him for many years. While precise day-by-day details of his time in custody were not publicized, the broad contours are clear. He moved into the network of federal prisons that housed many figures from New York's organized crime cases, institutions where the Bureau of Prisons tried to keep potentially dangerous alliances in check, but could not entirely erase existing hierarchies and loyalties. There, inmates with long-standing reputations often retained a certain deference from others, even if the practical power they once held on city streets was sharply curtailed by locked doors and regimented schedules. From the standpoint of federal investigators, however, the danger posed by someone in Bellomo's position did not necessarily end with incarceration. The history of organized crime in the United States included many examples of leaders who continued to exert influence from behind bars, using coded conversations on monitored telephones, seemingly innocuous messages passed through visitors, or intermediaries released earlier than they were. Authorities were keenly aware of this pattern. They monitored prison communications as regulations allowed, scrutinized visitors lists, and tried to determine whether orders or advice were still flowing from incarcerated bosses to free world associates. Publicly available records do not offer a detailed transcript of every monitored call or visit involving Bellomo during these years, and it would be speculative to claim knowledge of his private intentions. What is documented is that, even while he served his sentence, law enforcement intelligence assessments about the Genovese family often continued to list him among its key figures, sometimes as the official boss, even if others were described as acting in that capacity on the street. This duality, formal titles attributed by investigators versus the practical reality of who was available and free to act, became a recurring theme in discussions of the family's leadership. On the outside, the 1990s and early 2000s were a period of continued pressure on the Genovese organization. Building on earlier RICO successes, federal prosecutors pursued a series of cases targeting specific rackets: construction, garbage hauling, waterfront labor, and the window replacement business, among others. These industries had long been vulnerable to organized crime, because they depended heavily on unionized labor and complex contracting arrangements, creating many points where pressure could be applied. Each case chipped away at the network of influence that earlier generations had patiently constructed, removing experienced capos and corrupt union officials, exposing financial arrangements, and creating new cooperators who could explain the inner workings of the schemes. Inside the Genovese ranks, these prosecutions forced repeated adjustments. Acting bosses, street bosses, and front figures emerged, then disappeared into custody. Names such as Dominic Quiet Dom Cirillo, Daniel Danny the Lion Leo, and others surfaced in indictments and wiretap affidavits as men temporarily managing day-to-day affairs, while Vincent Chin Gigant remained the historically recognized boss, and figures like Bellomo were serving prison sentences. For law enforcement, this confirmed a long-held understanding. The family operated less like a rigid monarchy and more like a self-repairing network, plugging gaps as they appeared. While Bellomo was in prison, his lawyers did what defense attorneys in major organized crime cases often do in the years after sentencing. They examined the trial record and plea proceedings for possible appellate issues, challenged aspects of his confinement where appropriate, and monitored new legal developments that might affect his situation. The available record does not show any dramatic reversal or vacated conviction. His sentence stood. But through these efforts, his legal team ensured that his case remained active on court dockets, if only at the margins, and that he was positioned to take advantage of any favorable change in guidelines or case law. Meanwhile, the public image of the American mafia was changing. Popular culture still produced films and television series drawing on the mythology of the mid-20th century Cosa Nostra, but the reality documented in court filings looked more prosaic. Gone were many of the ostentatious social clubs and public displays that had once attracted both local admiration and law enforcement scrutiny. In their place were more discreet meeting spots, a stronger emphasis on operating through legitimate-seeming businesses, and among some members, a quieter personal style that aimed to avoid the attention their predecessors had courted. Liborio Bellomo's low profile fit this newer pattern. There were no operatic courtroom outbursts or media performances associated with his name. When he appeared in photographs, it was usually as part of a group of defendants, escorted by marshals, heads slightly bowed. The contrast with the flamboyant media persona of someone like John Gotti was striking. To agents and prosecutors who believed he wielded serious influence, this was not a sign that he was less important, but that he represented a different model of leadership, one that sought durability and insulation over notoriety. After serving most of his sentence, the bulk of a decade when measured from his initial arrest in the mid-1990s, Bellomo was released from federal custody in the early 2000s to begin a period of supervised release. By then he was in his late 40s, far removed in age and circumstance from the young associate who had started out under the wing of the 116th Street crew. The terms of supervised release, standard in federal cases of this kind, barred him from associating with known felons or members of organized crime, required regular check-ins with probation officers, and obligated him to avoid any new criminal conduct. On paper, these conditions were designed to sever his ties with the world that had led to his conviction. In practice, however, law enforcement officials remained deeply skeptical that a man they had long regarded as a central figure in the Genovese hierarchy would simply walk away. Surveillance, informant reporting, and intelligence gathering continued almost from the moment he left prison. Agents watched to see whom he met, what patterns of movement re-emerged, and whether the same restaurants, social circles, or business fronts would once again appear in their reports. For them, his release represented not just the return of a single individual, but a potential catalyst for the reorganization of a network that had been weakened, but not eliminated, by years of prosecutions. Within a relatively short span of time, the suspicions of investigators crystallized into a new criminal case. In 2006, federal prosecutors in New York unsealed an indictment that once again placed Liborio Bellomo near the center of a racketeering conspiracy. The charges reached back into the early 1990s and forward into the years following his release, alleging not only renewed involvement in extortion and labor racketeering, but also a connection to a particularly serious act of violence: the killing of a Bronx loan shark named Ralph DeSimone in 1991. According to the indictment and related court documents, DeSimone had been associated with organized crime and had come under suspicion as a potential government cooperator. In that tense world, the mere belief that someone might be ready to assist law enforcement could lead to lethal consequences. Prosecutors claimed that Bellomo and other Genovese figures had conspired in DeSimone's murder as part of an effort to maintain internal discipline and deter betrayal. It was a charge that, if proven, would have dramatically increased his potential punishment beyond that associated with economic racketeering. In addition to the murder conspiracy allegation, the 2006 case renewed and expanded the government's earlier portrayal of his role in labor and construction rackets. Prosecutors accused him and his co-defendants of manipulating the operations of certain unions and extorting payments from contractors and businesses connected to large venues and projects, including work related to Manhattan's Jacob K. Javits Convention Center. Contractors were said to have been pressured into making regular payments or granting favored status to companies tied to the Genovese family in exchange for assurances that their work would proceed without labor disruptions or other difficulties. Once again, Bellomo's defense team pushed back forcefully. They emphasized that the alleged murder conspiracy dated from years before his first conviction, and argued that resurrecting such an old allegation raised questions of fairness, especially when many of the participants and witnesses' memories could have faded or been influenced by intervening events. On the racketeering counts, They reiterated earlier criticisms of the government's reliance on cooperators and circumstantial patterns of association, suggesting that prosecutors were trying to turn every social contact into evidence of a criminal agreement. The legal confrontation over the DeSimone charge was particularly intense. It is one thing, in a racketeering case, to argue over extortionate collection of debts or the corrupt steering of contracts. Such acts, while serious, are firmly in the realm of economic crime. It is another to persuade a court and a potential jury that a defendant participated in arranging a killing. Defense lawyers highlighted the lack of physical evidence tying Bellomo directly to the act, the credibility issues surrounding some of the witnesses, and the government's previous inability over many years to secure an indictment on that specific allegation. As pre-trial maneuvering unfolded, both sides had reasons to consider the risks of going to a full jury trial on all counts. For the government, the prospect of trying to prove a decades-old murder conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, on top of the already complex economic racketeering allegations, carried uncertainties. For Bellomo, despite the weaknesses his attorneys perceived, the possibility of a conviction on a violent charge with no statute of limitations meant exposure to a very lengthy sentence that could effectively ensure he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Ultimately, the case moved toward a negotiated resolution. In 2007, Bellomo chose to plead guilty to racketeering-related charges that focused on extortion and labor racketeering, while the most serious allegations, including the murder conspiracy, were dropped as part of the agreement. In open court, he acknowledged participation in schemes to extort payments from businesses and to influence union activity unlawfully. Prosecutors, for their part, secured a renewed formal acknowledgement from a man they regarded as a top Genovese leader that he had been involved in organized criminal conduct targeting the construction and labor sectors. The sentencing that followed in 2008 reflected an unusual convergence of factors. On one hand, the racketeering conduct to which he had pleaded was serious, and prosecutors urged the court to consider the broader context of his history and the alleged, but now unproven, violent acts when assessing punishment. On the other hand, he had already spent many years in federal custody, both on his earlier conviction and in pre-trial detention on the new charges. His lawyers argued that the time he had served should weigh heavily, that the sentence should not effectively duplicate past punishment. In the end, the judge imposed a sentence that credited much of his prior incarceration, resulting in a term that did not add dramatically to the years he had already spent behind bars. The effect was that, within a relatively short period after the 2008 sentencing, Bellomo was again released from federal custody, older now, and having spent a significant portion of his adult life in prison or under indictment. His public record showed multiple serious convictions for racketeering and related crimes, as well as the government's repeated insistence that he had played a high-level role in sustaining the Genovese family's operations. For law enforcement, his second release presented both continuity and change. They had seen this pattern before. A major figure serves a long sentence, returns to the community, and is either drawn back into old networks or carefully avoided by those trying to avoid renewed scrutiny. Intelligence assessments in the years that followed often continued to name him as a significant presence in the Genovese hierarchy, though now such assessments tended to be more cautious in their language, emphasizing that they were based on informant reporting and analytical judgment rather than on fresh criminal charges. For the public, however, his reemergence passed largely without fanfare. The media landscape had shifted, with organized crime stories jostling for attention alongside terrorism, financial crises, and other national concerns. When his name did appear in print after 2008, it was usually in the context of retrospective pieces about the mafia's changing fortunes, or in brief mentions within stories about new prosecutions of lower-level Genovese figures. the era when the arrest of a single reputed boss could dominate the front pages for days was, by then, decisively over. Nonetheless, the arc of his life up to that point, early immersion in a neighborhood where the Genovese family had deep roots, a rise through the 116th Street crew, identification by prosecutors as an acting or street boss, multiple major racketeering convictions, and 2 extended periods in federal prison had firmly fixed Liborio Bellomo in the historical record of American organized crime. His story intersected with many of the key developments that had reshaped that world since the 1970s. The advent and use of RICO, the decline of the old-style social clubs, the steady erosion of mafia control over unions and construction, and the shift from flamboyant to more understated models of leadership. What remained, after his release, were unresolved questions that could not be answered definitively from court dockets alone. To what extent did he continue to exercise influence, whether formally or informally, within the Genovese family? How did his experiences with long-term incarceration and repeated prosecutions shape his choices in later years? And how would law enforcement's evolving strategies, now increasingly focused on financial crime, international networks, and new forms of organized illicit activity, intersect with the more traditional structures in which he had built his reputation? In the years that followed, his name would surface only intermittently in official documents, but the legacy of the prosecutions that had defined his middle decades would continue to shape how both authorities and historians understood the enduring, if diminished, power of New York's most secretive crime family. The next decade offered only partial answers, and most of those came not from Liborio Bellomo himself, but from the documents and offhand remarks of the people still trying to track him. When he walked out of federal custody after his 2008 sentencing, there were no television crews waiting, no triumphant return to a neighborhood social club. He was in his early 50s now, carrying the weight of 2 major racketeering convictions and a combined span of years spent in prison. New York, too, was a different place from the city he had known as a younger man. Many of the old East Harlem storefronts that had formed the backdrop of his early life were gone or transformed. Whole blocks were in the process of gentrifying, and the old social clubs that had once functioned as informal headquarters for crews tied to the Genovese family had largely closed or gone underground. For someone in his position, the official conditions of release were familiar. No association with known felons or organized crime figures, no new criminal conduct, regular reporting to federal probation officers. On paper, the rules left little room to return to the life that had led to his earlier convictions. Yet the informal expectations of his world were harder to codify and harder to escape. In that world, rank and reputation did not simply evaporate because a judge signed a release order. A man who had been described in public indictments as an acting or street boss for the Genovese family, and who had survived 2 waves of prosecutions without a murder conviction, occupied a particular kind of symbolic space, even if the precise extent of his influence after 2008 could only be inferred, not directly observed. For federal agents and organized crime prosecutors, that symbolic space mattered. Their experience by this point spanned several generations of mafia leadership. They had seen figures like Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano die in office or in the street, and others like John Gotti and Vincent Gigant spend their final years in prison. They had also seen how quickly an apparent decapitation of a crime family could be followed by the quiet emergence of new faces at the top. In internal briefings and criminal complaints targeting lower-level Genovese members, investigators in the late 2000s and 2010s continued to refer to Bellomo as holding a senior position, often described simply as boss of the family, while noting that day-to-day operations were delegated to acting bosses and influential capos. These references were not casual. In a number of cases where other Genovese figures were indicted, prosecutors inserted boilerplate background sections describing the family's hierarchy. In some of these, they named Liborio Bellomo as the official leader, even though he was not a defendant in the particular case. Such statements, while not evidence in themselves, indicated the government's working assessment that his release had not marked the end of his importance within the organization, at least in their analytical framework. He, for his part, maintained the silence that had long been characteristic of his public persona. There were no interviews, no memoirs, no on-the-record statements disputing or confirming law enforcement's characterizations. Meanwhile, the world of organized crime around him was in flux. The classic rackets that had defined the old 116th Street crew, illegal gambling, loan sharking, protection payments from small businesses, had not vanished, but they no longer provided the same central artery of income they once did. State lotteries and legal casinos competed with traditional numbers games and sports books. Immigration patterns had diversified the city's underworld, bringing in new players from Latin America, Eastern Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. Law enforcement attention had shifted heavily toward narcotics trafficking, international money laundering, cybercrime, and terrorism. In that crowded field, the Genovese family and the other New York mafia organizations had to adapt or wither. Evidence from later indictments suggests that the Genovese adaptation strategy leaned heavily on continuity, holding on to deep-rooted influence in unions and certain regulated industries, while cautiously experimenting with newer opportunities like internet-based gambling and healthcare fraud. Labor racketeering remained a particular focus, not least because decades of entrenched relationships could not be uprooted overnight. In sectors such as construction, waste hauling, waterfront work, and hospitality, federal and state cases throughout the 2010s continued to expose patterns of bribery, no-show jobs, bid rigging, and extortion in which Genovese connected figures appeared. Even when Bellomo's name did not appear on the indictment lines, it sometimes surfaced in the narrative. Agents drafting affidavits to obtain wiretaps or search warrants would explain to judges that the suspects they sought to monitor were part of a broader organization whose current boss, according to law enforcement information, was Liborio Bellomo. Such phrasing was carefully hedged, acknowledging that this was an assessment, not a fresh conviction, but it kept his name alive in the official record. To younger agents, he was a link to an earlier era, a man who had come up under Anthony Salerno and Vincent Gigant, and who, if the assessments were accurate, had managed to navigate the transition into a more cautious, financially focused underworld. On the street, the visible face of the Genovese family increasingly belonged to others. Acting bosses and high-ranking capos such as Dominic, Quiet Dom, Cirillo, Daniel Leo, Arthur Negro, and later smaller regional figures took the public brunt of law enforcement actions. Indictments in 2010, 2011, and subsequent years outlined schemes in which they and their underlings were accused of shaking down construction firms, fixing bids, siphoning union health funds, and running illegal gambling rings that now frequently used offshore websites and encrypted communications in place of the old handwritten ledgers and pay phones. The 116th Street crew itself, the group most closely associated with Bellomo's origins, also came under renewed scrutiny. Once tied firmly to Pleasant Avenue and East Harlem, its operations had stretched over the years into the Bronx, Westchester, and beyond, following the dispersion of Italian-American communities and the shifting patterns of urban redevelopment. In 2016, federal and local authorities announced a sweeping case against alleged members and associates of the crew, charging them with racketeering that included extortion of local restaurants and bars, loan sharking, and the control of certain gambling and bookmaking operations. The press release that accompanied the arrests described the Genovese family as still alive and well, and in its background section, named Liborio Bellomo as the family's current boss. even though he was not among those arrested or charged. For outside observers, that juxtaposition was striking. On one hand, here were detailed allegations against street-level and mid-level figures, men accused of threatening small business owners who fell behind on payments, of using their reputations to extract money in exchange for protection or favorable treatment. On the other hand, the man identified as the boss by prosecutors remained a shadowy presence, mentioned by name but not in the list of defendants. Reporters covering the case noted this discrepancy, sometimes framing it as evidence of his caution and success in staying insulated from directly prosecutable conduct since his earlier convictions. For law enforcement, the situation highlighted a persistent challenge. RICO had given them powerful tools to tie leaders to the activities of their subordinates, but using those tools required fresh, concrete evidence, recent communications, financial records, or cooperating witnesses with credible, first-hand knowledge. Simply believing, even on the basis of informant reports, that someone remained a boss was not enough to secure an indictment that would withstand judicial scrutiny. Prosecutors had already used their strongest murder conspiracy allegation, the DeSimone case, in the 2006 indictment, and had ultimately agreed to set it aside as part of the 2007 plea deal. To bring a third major case against Bellomo, they would have needed a new, clearly defined set of acts within the statute of limitations, supported by evidence that could survive cross-examination and appeals. No such case materialized in the years after 2008. Instead, his name circulated in a kind of orbit around other people's prosecutions, present in background narratives and organizational charts, absent from the captions. The absence did not mean that he had renounced or abandoned all underworld ties. Such a conclusion would go far beyond what the documentary record can support. It simply means that, from 2008 onward, law enforcement did not publicly charge him with new crimes, even as they continued to mention him as a figure of interest. Whatever choices he made about his daily life, where he went, whom he saw, how directly he involved himself in decisions, remained within a zone of ambiguity that investigators could not, or chose not to, pierce with a formal indictment. The broader environment in which he aged also changed in ways that altered the meaning of his alleged role. By the 2010s, the American mafia was a diminished force compared to its mid-century peak. The 5 New York families still existed. People were still being arrested under their banners. But their ability to dictate terms to industries across the city had been sharply curtailed by decades of sustained law enforcement pressure, internal betrayals, and economic shifts. Unions had new leadership and increased oversight. Corporate compliance departments, court-appointed monitors, and aggressive civil lawsuits made it more difficult to hide systematic corruption. Media and public attitudes, once prone to a kind of dark fascination with colorful mobsters, had grown more skeptical and less tolerant of any hint of romanticization. Within that context, the descriptor often attached to the Genovese family, that it was the most disciplined and low-key of the New York groups, took on a different resonance. Where once it had implied a greater capacity for long-term survival, it now also reflected a recognition that the family's power, while still real in certain niches, was bounded and heavily surveilled. Bellomo's reputed style, quiet, controlled, averse to spectacle, seemed in tune with this new reality. A flashy public persona in the gaudy mold had become a liability, not an asset. If he did continue to hold a leadership role, as law enforcement assessments suggested, it was likely exercised from behind layers of buffers, through intermediaries whose own activities often fell into legally gray areas at the edge of what prosecutors could prove. As he moved into his 60s, a stage of life when many of his contemporaries from the old neighborhood had retired from whatever work they had pursued, the long arc of his involvement with the Genovese family invited a different kind of reflection. From the vantage point of historians and criminologists, his life illustrated the trajectory of a particular generation of American organized crime figures, Born into dense immigrant enclaves in the 1950s, coming of age just as RICO and modern federal strategies were taking shape, rising into positions of influence in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and then spending a significant portion of their prime years under indictment or in prison. The toll of that trajectory was measurable not only in years behind bars, but also in the collateral consequences for families and communities. Court records from his cases, for instance, occasionally alluded to relatives who attended hearings, to the impact of his imprisonment on dependents, to the economic dislocation caused when someone who had been a provider, however illicitly, was suddenly removed. The victims of his admitted racketeering conduct bore their own burdens. Small business owners who spent years making extortion payments instead of reinvesting in their enterprises. Union members whose benefits and wages were undercut by corrupt deals. Contractors who either lost out on jobs because they refused to pay or pass the costs of doing so on to customers and taxpayers. In interviews and academic work about the decline of the traditional mafia, some former prosecutors and FBI agents have spoken of a kind of paradox. Success in dismantling the worst excesses of organized crime power structures, coupled with the persistence of smaller scale, more fragmented criminal activity that is harder to track, and in some ways harder to address. Within that paradox, figures like Liborio Bellomo occupy an ambiguous place. They are no longer the untouchable, quasi-mythic bosses of mid-century lore. They are men with documented convictions, known to law enforcement, operating in an environment where any misstep could trigger another round of charges. And yet, their historical role and the lingering weight of their reputations mean that their names still surface whenever analysts try to summarize who, if anyone, holds the reins of the old families. By the early 2020s, references to him in the public record had grown more sporadic. When they did appear, it was often in passing, a line in a news article about a new Genovese-related indictment, a footnote in a scholarly work on organized crime, a mention in a law enforcement presentation about contemporary mafia structures. These mentions typically reiterated the same basic elements. Born in New York in 1957, longtime member and leader of the 116th Street crew, convicted twice of racketeering, regarded by authorities as a top figure in the Genovese family. No new allegations of specific acts were added to the list, at least not in the formal way that would show up on a docket sheet. For a documentary viewer tracing his life from the crowded tenements of East Harlem to the quieter suburbs and back through the corridors of federal courthouses, this later chapter might feel anticlimactic. There were no dramatic final confrontations, no public renunciations, no widely photographed funerals drawing crowds of mourners and plainclothes detectives. Instead, there was a gradual fading from center stage into the half-light that had always been his preferred environment. Yet this, too, is part of the story of organized crime in America in the 21st century. Not only the spectacular takedowns and headline-grabbing trials, but also the long, slow diminishment of once dominant networks into more contained, more cautiously managed enterprises. Through it all, what remained fixed were the points that could be documented with confidence. The early immersion in a neighborhood deeply influenced by the Genovese family. The rise through the 116th Street crew to a position that prosecutors, agents, and cooperating witnesses independently described as high-level leadership. The guilty pleas in 1990s and 2000s racketeering cases acknowledging his role in extortion and labor corruption schemes. And the years spent behind bars as a result. Around those points lay a penumbra of inference, allegation, and cautious analysis about his post-release role, material that must be treated with care. Precisely labeled as law enforcement belief, rather than judicially established fact. In that sense, the later years of Liborio Bellomo's life bring the tension between secrecy and documentation, so central to the history of the mafia, into sharp relief. The very skills that had helped him rise. an aversion to unnecessary attention, an ability to operate through intermediaries, a preference for quiet influence over overt displays, also ensure that the final chapters of his story, whatever they may be in personal terms, will likely remain only partially visible to the public record. What can be seen clearly is the trail he left through courtrooms and prison registers, through union halls and construction sites affected by his admitted conduct, and through the evolving strategies of the law enforcement agencies that learned, in part by pursuing him, how to adapt to a changing landscape of organized crime. In the summer of 2016, long after many observers had assumed that the classic New York mafia was fading into history, familiar names resurfaced on a Justice Department press release. Federal prosecutors announced charges against dozens of alleged mob figures tied to what they called the East Coast LCN enterprise, a loose coalition of members and associates from several families, including the Genovese. The list of defendants stretched from New York to Florida, and the alleged crimes, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, healthcare fraud, could have been lifted from indictments written decades earlier, updated only slightly for the age of offshore betting websites and prepaid mobile phones. Among those named was Pasquale "Patsy" Parello, an aging Bronx restaurateur whom the government described as a Genovese capo with roots in the same 116th Street orbit that had shaped Liborio Bellomo's career. The complaint accused Parello and his associates of shaking down local restaurants and bars, extending high-interest loans to people in financial distress, and pressuring debtors with threats based on their reputation for violence. It was a familiar pattern. Food businesses asked to make regular payments in exchange for protection from trouble. Gamblers and small-time bookmakers nudged into paying a cut to the crew. People on the fringe of the underworld discovering that the money they had borrowed came with a price far higher than the stated interest. What caught the attention of those who had been following organized crime cases for years was not simply the scale of the arrests, but the presence of a name that did not appear in the list of defendants at all. In the background sections of the complaint and in statements made in court, prosecutors once again identified Liborio Bellomo as the boss of the Genovese family. They asserted that Parello, though powerful in his own right, was ultimately subordinate to Bellomo and operated with his knowledge and approval. The man who had twice pleaded guilty to racketeering and spent large portions of his adult life in federal prison was now, in the government's description, the senior figure at the top of an organization that, while diminished, still existed. This was not the first time in the 2010s that his name had surfaced in this way. Earlier cases against other Genovese figures had featured similar background descriptions, explanatory paragraphs for judges and juries unfamiliar with the internal jargon of bosses, capos, and crews. But the 2016 case drove the point home with unusual clarity. At a bail hearing for Parello, a federal prosecutor argued that he had continued to run Genovese-connected rackets into his late 70s. In the course of that argument, the prosecutor described how, according to informants and surveillance, Parello deferred to Bellomo as the family's leader. The implication was that, even if he was not being charged, Bellomo remained central to the decision-making structure as understood by law enforcement. The defense in that case challenged the government's portrayal, as defense attorneys commonly do. They questioned the reliability of informants, argued that prosecutors were recycling old narratives about mafia hierarchies without fresh evidence, and pointed out that if the government truly believed Bellomo was actively directing criminal operations, it could have indicted him. The prosecution's response was constrained both by legal strategy and by the realities of evidence. To bring a viable case, they needed more than a belief about who held an honorary title. They needed recordings, documents, or cooperator testimony that could tie him directly to specific acts within the applicable statute of limitations. What emerged from these exchanges was a clearer sense of the gap between law enforcement assessments and what could be proven in court. Over the years, Through debriefings with cooperators, surveillance, and long experience, agents and prosecutors had developed an internal map of the Genovese family in which Bellomo's name sat at or near the top. That map was reflected in background sections of indictments and in statements to judges. But converting that analytical map into a prosecutable case against him personally would have required new, concrete evidence that did not materialize, or that, if it did, remained insufficiently strong to justify the risks and resources of another major RICO prosecution. In the meantime, the day-to-day reality of the rackets described in the 2016 case, and others like it, closely resembled the ones that had formed the basis of the earlier prosecutions against Bellomo. Restaurant owners in the Bronx and Manhattan neighborhoods, once dominated by Italian-American residents, now catered to a more diverse clientele. But the pressures they faced from organized extortion were similar. Quiet visits from men known to be connected, suggestions that paying a regular fee would keep unpleasant incidents from marring business, and an understanding that refusing could bring consequences not easily addressed by calling the police. Gamblers who placed bets through offshore websites still needed local credit and local collection. Those services, in the government's view, were provided by crews that owed allegiance up the chain. The social impact of these continuing cases echoed, on a smaller and more fragmented scale, the patterns of earlier decades. Workers in unionized sectors, construction, waste hauling, maintenance, still found that some hearing halls and job assignments operated on unwritten rules shaped by relationships with underworld figures. Honest contractors who resisted paying tribute to crews associated with the Genovese or other families sometimes found themselves underbid by competitors willing to go along, or faced sudden labor issues that cost time and money. The victims very rarely appeared as central characters in news stories. They were background presences, referred to as Business Owner 1 or Victim 2 in court filings. Yet their experiences were integral to understanding the real-world consequences of the kind of racketeering activity to which Bellomo had previously admitted. At the same time, there were important differences. Unlike in the 1970s and 1980s, when mafia influence over entire industries could be so pervasive that it formed a kind of parallel regulatory system, by the 2010s, such influence was more episodic and contested. The Javits Center, whose union locals and contracts had once been cited in cases involving Bellomo and his associates, now operated under enhanced oversight arrangements instituted in part because of those earlier prosecutions. Court-appointed monitors, internal compliance officers, and more aggressive investigative journalism made it harder for systemic corruption to flourish unnoticed. The same was true in the building trades. While pockets of mob influence persisted, years of consent decrees, racketeering suits, and internal reform movements had altered the landscape. Bellomo's earlier cases had played a role in driving those changes. His guilty pleas in the 1990s and 2000s, particularly the admissions related to labor racketeering and extortion in the construction sector, were among the building blocks used by reformers to argue for tighter oversight. When regulators and legislators sought to justify more intrusive supervision of unions or the imposition of independent monitorships over certain locals, they often pointed to the documented history of Genovese influence, citing court records that included his name. In this way, the story of one man's criminal liability intersected with the larger story of institutional change. Inside the Italian-American communities that had once provided much of the mafia's recruiting base, these developments generated their own quiet conflicts. By the time Bellomo returned from his second major prison term, the demographics of neighborhoods like East Harlem and the Bronx's Belmont section had shifted substantially. Younger generations of Italian Americans were more likely to have moved to the suburbs or other parts of the country, more likely to be college educated, and more likely to view organized crime not as a rough-edged form of neighborhood governance, but as an obstacle to full social and economic participation. Community leaders, clergy, and local politicians of Italian descent increasingly spoke out against the lingering romanticization of figures like Al Capone or fictional characters from film and television. At the same time, there remained pockets of ambivalence. In areas where distrust of formal institutions ran deep, some older residents still recalled times when going to the guys, rather than the police, seemed like the more effective way to resolve small disputes or get help with a problem. The death or incarceration of long-time local figures could be experienced as a loss, even by people who disapproved of their criminal activities, simply because those figures had been part of the neighborhood's fabric for decades. In this sense, Bellomo's trajectory, rising from a tight-knit enclave, spending years in prison, returning to a city transformed, mirrored the broader tension between loyalty to place and the harms caused by the criminal networks that had once dominated those places. For law enforcement professionals and scholars studying organized crime, his life offered a useful case study in how leadership styles within the mafia had evolved under pressure. The flamboyant, media-seeking bosses of the 1980s, whose trials turned into near-theatrical events, had given way to a generation that understood publicity as a liability. Bellomo's preference for a low public profile, his habit of avoiding cameras and reporters, and his refusal to engage in courtroom theatrics were all cited as examples of a corporate model of underworld leadership, one that sought to blend into the background, emphasizing control over spectacle. Training materials for prosecutors and agents, while not focused on him alone, drew lessons from the cases in which he figured. PowerPoint slides in law enforcement conferences outlined how long-term surveillance, strategic use of informants, and coordinated multi-district prosecutions had been required to build cases against higher-level Genovese figures in the 1990s and 2000s. Charts showing the family's structure over time, based on a combination of informant debriefings and investigative work, routinely listed his name at key junctures. As a rising soldier in the 1980s, as an alleged front-line leader in the 1990s, as a convicted racketeer in the 2000s, and as a reputed boss in the 2010s. Yet those same training materials also underscored the limits of legal tools. Despite the power of RICO, despite sophisticated surveillance technology, investigators had not been able, or had chosen not, to bring a new case against him after 2006. This reality highlighted a tension at the heart of democratic criminal justice systems: the need to balance robust efforts against entrenched criminal organizations with the requirement that individuals be charged only when there is admissible, persuasive evidence of specific crimes within defined time frames. Unlike authoritarian regimes that might rely on broad categories of dangerousness to incarcerate perceived threats indefinitely, American prosecutors remained bound by the narrower standards of proof and procedure that had, in earlier periods, sometimes allowed powerful mob figures to operate with impunity. From the standpoint of contemporary criminology, Bellomo's long involvement with the Genovese family raised broader questions about continuity and change in organized crime. On one level, his career seemed to confirm the durability of certain patterns: the importance of neighborhood networks in early recruitment, the role of shared ethnicity and socialization in creating trust within criminal enterprises, and the persistent appeal, to a small subset of individuals, of the power and money that could be obtained through illegal means. On another level, the latter decades of his life illustrated how external pressures, legal innovations like RICO, shifts in law enforcement strategy, and changing economic structures could reshape the opportunities available to organized crime leaders, forcing them into more defensive, risk-averse postures. For younger would-be associates coming up in the 2000s and 2010s, the example of someone like Liborio Bellomo was double-edged. On one hand, his survival through multiple waves of prosecutions, his continued nomming in law enforcement intelligence as a boss, and the aura that surrounded any man widely believed to be at the top of a mafia family could reinforce the notion that such a path still offered status and influence. On the other hand, his repeated trips to federal prison, the length of his sentences, and the knowledge that his every movement was likely watched or reported upon by informants sent a stark message about the personal costs of that status. What he himself thought about those trade-offs in later life is not part of the public record. Unlike some former mobsters who eventually chose to cooperate with authorities or to publish memoirs recasting themselves as cautionary tales, Bellomo maintained the code of silence he had lived by for decades. There are no public interviews in which he reflects on his choices, no court statements in which he dramatically renounces his past, no op-eds urging young people to stay away from the life. His only words preserved in official documents are the clipped, carefully constructed answers given during plea hearings, where judges confirmed that he understood the charges and the consequences of admitting guilt. What can be said, based firmly on documented history, is that by the time he reached his 60s, the arc of his life had become inseparable from the story of how New York and the federal government confronted organized crime from the 1970s onward. He had been on the receiving end of some of the most significant tools deployed in that struggle: long-term undercover operations, the strategic flipping of insiders, and the application of RICO to dismantle not just individual rackets, but the leadership structures behind them. The cases against him had, in turn, contributed to broader reforms in industries he and his associates had exploited, leaving traces in union bylaws, corporate compliance programs, and regulatory oversight mechanisms. In the neighborhoods where his name once carried immediate weight, the memory of his direct involvement has gradually blurred into the general history of the mob. As older generations pass away, and younger ones grow up in a city where the most pressing concerns lie elsewhere. Yet for those charged with understanding and preventing organized criminal activity, in law enforcement, in academia, and in policy circles, Liborio Bellomo remains an instructive figure. His life offers a concrete, document-supported example of how an individual can rise and adapt within a long-standing criminal organization, how law enforcement strategies can constrain but not entirely eliminate such organizations, and how the consequences of those intertwined histories ripple outward through communities and institutions for decades. For anyone trying to understand the life of Liborio Bellomo, the most striking fact is how little of it was ever meant to be seen. The men who built and maintained the Genovese crime family prided themselves on staying off the front pages, and Bellomo was very much a product of that culture. What survives of his story lies mostly in documents that were never written with biography in mind. Indictments assembled by prosecutors, transcripts of plea hearings and sentencings, appellate rulings on questions of bail or evidence, press accounts stitched together from anonymous law enforcement sources, and the occasional remark in academic studies of organized crime. Piecing those fragments together offers a clear outline of his public life, but it also reveals the limits of what can be known about a man whose business was secrecy. The government's narrative of who he was and what he did is spelled out most fully in the major racketeering cases that bore his name. In those, prosecutors described him as a pivotal figure in the 116th Street crew, and later as an acting or street boss for the entire Genovese family, someone whose authority extended over extortion rackets, gambling operations, and corrupt relationships with certain unions and contractors. Defense attorneys, by contrast, presented a narrower picture, a neighborhood man whose associations had been exaggerated into a leadership role, whose every social contact was interpreted through the lens of an investigation that had already decided what it wanted to see. Appellate decisions from the 1990s and 2000s provide glimpses of how neutral judges, bound by legal standards rather than investigative hunches, weighed these competing portraits. In rulings on pre-trial detention and bail, for example, federal courts examined evidence about Bellomo's alleged position in the Genovese hierarchy to decide whether he posed a danger to the community or a risk of flight. The judges did not treat the government's assertions as proven fact, but they also did not dismiss them out of hand. Instead, they analyzed the record in a highly structured way. Past convictions, the nature of the charged enterprise, the length of potential sentences, any history of intimidation or obstruction, and the credibility of witnesses. Those rulings often upheld the government's position that he should remain detained pending trial. The logic was driven less by personal animus than by a legal framework that had evolved in direct response to the challenges posed by organized crime. When Congress revised the federal bail laws in the 1980s to allow detention based on dangerousness, lawmakers had in mind precisely the scenario of a reputed mafia leader whose mere freedom, even before conviction, could help sustain a network of extortion and silence. Judges considering Bellomo's situation cited that legislative history, noting that if the allegations about his role were true, his release could facilitate ongoing racketeering even without any new violent acts. At the heart of many of these determinations lay the testimony of cooperating witnesses, former associates, and occasionally former made members, who had decided to break the long-standing code of omerta and talk to the government. Their accounts were sometimes vivid in detail, recounting conversations in back rooms, hand signals across crowded cafes, and lists of payments written on slips of paper that were later burned. They described Bellomo sitting in on sensitive meetings, resolving disputes over territory or income splits, and relaying or shaping the wishes of higher-ranking figures. Defense attorneys attacked these witnesses relentlessly. They highlighted their criminal records, the sentences they hoped to avoid, and the benefits they stood to gain by giving prosecutors what they wanted. Cross-examinations probed inconsistencies between different versions of their stories, asked why certain details emerged only after plea negotiations began, and drew attention to the way memory can be reshaped over time by repeated retellings. In a courtroom, these challenges were essential, and in some instances they persuaded judges or juries to discount particular claims. But in the aggregate, across multiple cases and multiple cooperators who had moved in similar circles at different times, certain patterns about Bellomo's position within the Genovese family emerged again and again. The reliance on cooperators was itself a product of earlier eras of conflict between law enforcement and the mafia. For decades, prosecutors had struggled to penetrate the insular world of the Italian-American crime families. Surveillance could show who met whom and when, but often not what was said. Financial records could reveal odd cash flows, but not the threats or promises that explained them. It was only when a critical mass of insiders began to break ranks, spurred by long RICO sentences, the witness security program, and disillusionment with the romantic myths of the life, that a fuller picture of the internal structure came into focus. Bellomo's rise and his early prosecutions occurred at precisely the moment when this shift was taking place. The very existence of that shift says something about the world he came from. The traditional code of silence was not just a tactical device. It was wrapped up in notions of honor, loyalty, and manhood that had deep roots in certain immigrant and post-immigrant communities. Those norms were passed down in social clubs, at family tables, even in the stories older men told on street corners. When associates or maid members began to cooperate with authorities in larger numbers, they were not merely breaking a rule. They were upending an entire moral framework as it had been taught within those circles. That a number of such men were willing to testify about Bellomo's role underscores both how central he was perceived to be and how fundamentally the old culture was fraying under modern legal and social pressures. The legal aftermath of his cases also had concrete institutional effects beyond the courtroom. In the construction and labor sectors where he and his co-defendants had operated, reformers used the documented history of Genovese infiltration to press for structural changes. Consent decrees placed certain unions under court-supervised oversight, with independent monitors tasked with rooting out corruption. Hearing halls were required to adopt more transparent procedures. Bid review processes for public contracts were tightened, and employers were pushed to implement compliance programs designed to detect and prevent the kinds of off-the-books deals that had long fueled racketeering. In some instances, these reforms were directly linked to the very entities named in Bellomo's indictments. When prosecutors described how Genovese connected figures extracted payoffs from contractors working at major venues or on large municipal projects, they did so in a way that left little doubt about the need for enhanced scrutiny. Years later, when those same venues or agencies defended new oversight measures, they pointed back to the earlier corruption cases, sometimes with his name in the footnotes, as justification. Thus, his personal criminal liabilities fed into broader efforts to reshape the governance of powerful institutions, even if most of the people living and working under those new rules never heard his name. At the level of public perception, his career unfolded against the backdrop of a complicated conversation about Italian-American identity and media representation. By the 1990s and 2000s, civil rights and cultural organizations within the Italian-American community were increasingly vocal about the risks of stereotyping. They argued that constant portrayals of Italians as mobsters in film, television, and news coverage reinforced harmful associations, overshadowing the ordinary lives and achievements of millions of people of Italian descent. Popular series and movies that drew heavily on mafia imagery prompted protests and boycotts from some quarters, even as others embraced them as entertainment. In that debate, cases like Bellomo's functioned in a paradoxical way. On the one hand, they offered concrete evidence that organized crime connections within Italian-American neighborhoods were real, not inventions of Hollywood. On the other, they made it easy for casual observers to conflate a small criminal minority with an entire ethnic group. Responsible reporting on his indictments and convictions tried to walk a careful line, emphasizing that the vast majority of Italian Americans had no involvement in such activities, and that entire industries were not run by the mob in the monolithic way of old cliches. Still, the persistence of figures like him at the top of traditional mafia families made it harder to dispel the association entirely. For scholars of organized crime, comparing him with contemporaries from other families highlighted both similarities and distinctions in leadership style. Where John Gotti had embraced a kind of celebrity, walking in and out of Midtown Manhattan social clubs in tailored coats and relishing his Teflon Don nickname, Bellomo had done almost the opposite. His few public images show a man in plain clothes, often trying to avoid the camera's gaze, saying as little as possible in open court. Where some bosses, like Vic Amuso or Anthony Casso of the Lucchese family, had been linked to highly visible campaigns of violence and internal purges, the cases against Bellomo focused more on economic racketeering and the quiet enforcement mechanisms that underpinned it. This is not to say that violence was absent from the world he inhabited. The murder allegation in the De Simone case, though ultimately not proven in court against him, was a stark reminder that the ultimate sanction for disloyalty or perceived threat in that environment could be fatal. But the pattern of his public prosecutions, centered on extortion, labor corruption, and illegal gambling, reinforced the view of the Genovese family as a kind of shadowy economic actor, less prone to street corner bloodshed than some counterparts, more embedded in the administrative machinery of unions, businesses, and public contracts. In this, he embodied a transitional figure. His early mentors and the structures they built belonged to the era when the mafia's reach into major industries was at its peak. His own ascent and legal troubles marked the period when that reach was being systematically challenged and rolled back. His later years, in which he was more often mentioned than charged, reflected the new reality of a mafia that continued to exist, but within narrower confines and under constant observation. The strategies used against him also illustrated the evolution of law enforcement itself. Where earlier generations of investigators had often worked in silos, local police here, federal agents there, each hoarding intelligence. By the time of his major cases, multi-agency task forces and joint operations were the norm. FBI squads specializing in Italian-American organized crime coordinated with the New York Police Department, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General, the IRS, and sometimes state and local prosecutors. The indictments that named Bellomo often contained acknowledgments of this collaboration, listing multiple agencies whose combined data and manpower made such wide-ranging cases possible. Those task forces, in turn, learned from each operation. The experience gained in wiring up social clubs and tracking clandestine meetings in the 116th Street orbit was later applied to other targets. Non-Italian organized crime groups, corrupt public officials, even transnational criminal networks that had little in common culturally with the world that had shaped Bellomo. His cases helped refine investigative techniques, how to interpret coded language on wiretaps, how to corroborate cooperator statements with physical surveillance, how to map social networks within criminal organizations, that were then exported to other contexts. As the years went on and his direct presence in the headlines faded, what remained in the public sphere was a composite figure. The Liborio Bellomo of court papers, investigative reports, and academic analyses. He appeared as a node on organizational charts of the Genovese family, as a named defendant in key RICO cases, and as a recurring reference point in discussions about who currently led the family. He did not appear in the oral histories or memoirs that some former mobsters published after entering witness protection. Those who had turned government witness against the Genovese family tended to focus on their own immediate circles and on higher-profile figures like Salerno or Gigant. The absence of his voice in such narratives is itself telling, consistent with a life strategy that always favored discretion. By the time he had lived into his mid-60s, he occupied a rare position, one of the few living men whose documented career spanned from the tail end of the Appalachian-era generation to the fragmented, closely watched underworld of the 21st century. Men like Anthony Salerno and Vincent Gigant were gone, having died in federal custody. Many of his contemporaries from other families were serving life sentences, had disappeared from view, or had themselves become cooperators. That Bellomo had avoided a life term, escaped conviction on the most serious violent allegations, and remained, as far as the public record shows, outside of witness protection, marked him as an outlier in his cohort. What that meant in his intimate, personal life, how he navigated aging, health, family relationships, and the ever-present possibility of renewed scrutiny, is not recorded in any docket or press release. The documentary trail that began with his birth certificate in 1957 and wound through decades of investigative files slows to a trickle, offering only indirect signs of his continued existence. A passing mention in a more recent indictment's background section, an offhand allusion in a prosecutor's seminar presentation, an occasional line in a law enforcement assessment of the current structure of the Genovese family. What can be seen clearly, however, is the path that led him to that position. From East Harlem streets, where the 116th Street crew functioned as an unspoken authority, through the intense legal confrontations of the 1990s and 2000s, into an older age lived in the shadow of those cases, and of the organization whose fortunes rose and fell with his own. As he moved further into the 21st century, his story became less about new developments and more about legacy, about how his documented actions and the responses they provoked reshaped, in ways large and small, the underworld he once helped lead and the institutions that opposed it. By the time Liborio Bellomo moved into his late 60s, his world, at least as it could be seen from the outside, had grown very narrow and strangely expansive at the same time. Narrow, because there were no new indictments bearing his name, no fresh sets of court transcripts to pore over, no public speeches or interviews to chart. Expansive, because his earlier cases and the responses they provoked had by then infiltrated a wide array of institutions. Union constitutions rewritten to prevent racketeering, compliance manuals in construction firms warning against off-the-books deals, law enforcement training curricula using his prosecutions as case studies in how to dismantle long-standing criminal networks. The last firmly documented chapters of his life, as captured in official records, are already familiar. Born in New York City in 1957, raised in the dense Italian-American enclave of East Harlem, he came of age in the orbit of the 116th Street crew, a key component of the Genovese crime family. By the 1980s, law enforcement regarded him as a made member. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, as a rising organizer in the crew once overseen by Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno. In the mid-1990s, he was indicted under RICO, pleaded guilty to racketeering, and served a substantial federal sentence. After his release, he was again charged in 2006 with new racketeering offenses, this time including an allegation of involvement in a 1991 killing that was ultimately dropped as part of a plea agreement. He admitted to further extortion and labor corruption activity, received another significant sentence that overlapped with time already served, and re-entered civilian life around the end of the 2000s. From that point forward, the story shifts from courtroom drama to a quieter, more ambiguous space. Government assessments in later indictments and affidavits described him as the boss of the Genovese family, the man at the top of a still existing but diminished organization. Yet no new charges were brought against him personally. His name appeared in the background sections of cases targeting other alleged Genovese members and associates. It dropped into law enforcement briefings as analysts tried to sketch the current hierarchy of New York's mafia families. But the kind of evidentiary detail that had once filled pages of wiretap transcripts and cooperator testimony was no longer there. That absence is itself instructive. It does not mean that he renounced all contact with his old world. There is no document in which he publicly declares a break, no official certification of retirement from organized crime. It does, however, highlight the gap between belief and proof in the realm of organized crime enforcement. Investigators can be convinced, on the basis of informant reports and long experience, that someone continues to hold a position of influence. Translating that conviction into a viable case requires more. New recordings, recent financial records, first-hand witnesses willing to testify about specific acts within the legal time limits. In Bellomo's later years, whatever he did or did not do remained below that threshold, at least in terms of what prosecutors were prepared to put before a grand jury. For historians and viewers of this story, that line between documented fact and informed conjecture matters. The temptation to fill in the blanks with imagination is strong, especially when dealing with a subject as culturally charged as the mafia. Yet the most responsible way to approach a figure like Liborio Bellomo is to anchor the narrative in what can be shown. The indictments and pleas that bear his name, the sworn statements made in court, the consistent but carefully qualified assessments of law enforcement agencies, and the broader social and institutional changes that can be traced in part to his cases. Those cases had ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate circle of defendants and victims. In the construction industry, for example, the exposure of Genovese-linked extortion and bid rigging schemes in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, schemes in which Bellomo was repeatedly identified as a key organizer, helped spur reforms in how public contracts were awarded and monitored. Multi-million-dollar projects associated with entities like the New York City Housing Authority or the Javits Center came under increased scrutiny. Bid review boards were required to check more carefully for signs of collusion. Independent inspectors were given greater authority to probe subcontracting arrangements. Union locals named in earlier racketeering cases were placed under internal or court-ordered oversight. In the labor movement, the documented history of Genovese infiltration into certain locals provided ammunition for those pushing to clean house. Court-appointed monitors were installed in some unions, armed with broad investigative powers to examine hiring hall practices, dues spending, and officer elections. Education programs for rank and file members highlighted the ways in which corruption at the top could erode wages, benefits, and safety protections on the job. In some locals, that process was painful and contentious, involving leadership struggles and, at times, resistance from members wary of outside intervention. But the foundation of those efforts lay partly in the record created by cases like Bellomo's, records that showed, beyond speculation, how organized crime figures had used union power to enrich themselves at workers' expense. On the law enforcement side, the pursuit of Genovese leaders, including Bellomo, helped shape investigative doctrine. The use of RICO to tie leaders to patterns of extortion, gambling, and labor corruption became a model for how to approach other complex, hierarchical criminal enterprises. Agencies refined techniques for interpreting coded language on wiretaps, developed better methods for corroborating informant statements with physical surveillance and financial data, and learned how to structure multi-defendant indictments that told a coherent story without becoming unwieldy. These lessons were later applied not only to other mafia families, but also to transnational drug cartels, street gangs with formalized hierarchies, and networks involved in large-scale financial fraud. At the same time, the very success of these strategies raised broader questions about the nature and limits of criminal liability. Critics of expansive RICO prosecutions argued, in court and in scholarly writing, that the statute risked blurring individual responsibility by attributing to leaders the acts of subordinates they might not have specifically ordered. Supporters countered that without such tools, insulated bosses could evade punishment while continuing to profit from, and indirectly direct, their organization's conduct. Bellomo's cases sat near the center of that debate. They illustrated both the power of RICO to reach into the upper echelons of a criminal enterprise, and the care with which courts scrutinized the government's efforts to hold leaders accountable for actions carried out in a diffuse, secretive system. For the neighborhoods that had shaped him, the long arc of his life and prosecutions intersected with profound demographic and economic shifts. The East Harlem of his childhood, a largely Italian-American enclave with visible, if often unspoken, mafia influence, had largely given way to a more diverse, gentrifying landscape by the time of his later releases from prison. The Bronx and northern Manhattan communities tied historically to the 116th Street crew saw rising rents, new waves of immigrants, and changing forms of local commerce. The old social clubs closed or went underground. The informal authority they had represented was replaced, unevenly, by new community organizations, formal political structures, and in some cases, the encroachment of other criminal groups with very different cultural roots. Within Italian-American circles, his story became one data point in a larger argument about identity and legacy. Advocates seeking to decouple Italian heritage from mafia stereotypes pointed out that men like Bellomo represented a tiny fraction of the millions of Italian Americans whose lives were defined by ordinary struggles and achievements in business, education, the arts, and public service. At the same time, his documented role as a leader of a major mafia family was used, even within the community, as a cautionary tale about the costs of clinging to outdated notions of masculine honor and loyalty that had, in earlier generations, made it easier for organized crime to recruit and maintain support. For young people in the neighborhoods where his name still carried some resonance, the contrast between myth and reality was particularly stark. The cinematic imagery of omnipotent mob bosses, of easy money and glamorous danger, collided with the facts of Bellomo's record: multiple convictions, years lost to prison, constant surveillance, and the knowledge that some of his closest former associates had eventually turned government witnesses. Whatever informal prestige his past might have carried was inseparable from the concrete harms suffered by victims of extortion and labor fraud, and from the impact on his own family of having a father, brother, or uncle repeatedly taken away in handcuffs. From an ethical standpoint, his life underscores the cumulative damage inflicted by long-term involvement in organized crime. It is easy, in focusing on the big picture of bosses and families, to lose sight of the granular ways in which racketeering affects individuals. The shop owner who spends a decade making under-the-table payments instead of expanding a business. The laborer whose health benefits are quietly siphoned off through corrupt contracts. The honest contractor edged out of bids because he refuses to pay tribute or inflate invoices. Bellomo's guilty pleas, spread across two major cases, acknowledged participation in precisely those kinds of schemes. Whatever else remains contested about his role, those admissions anchor the moral assessment. He was part of a system that used fear, corruption, and hidden compulsion to transfer resources from vulnerable or unknowing people into the pockets of a small, self-selected group. His own personal cost is also part of the ledger. Taken together, the time he spent in federal custody spans much of his middle adulthood, years he might otherwise have spent raising children without interruption, building legitimate enterprises, or simply living outside the constant tension of potential indictment. Those lost years do not excuse the conduct that led to his sentences. They are the legally and morally foreseeable consequences of choices he made. But they do illustrate, in human terms, the hollowness of the old romantic notion that life at the top of a mafia family is a path to secure, untroubled power. As American organized crime has changed, the symbolic meaning of his continued presence in law enforcement assessments has shifted as well. In the mid-20th century, the boss of a New York mafia family was a formidable figure whose influence could shape entire industries and dictate, with few checks, the fates of people far beyond his immediate circle. By the early 21st century, a boss, even of a group as historically formidable as the Genovese family, operated in a much tighter space, watched, constrained by aggressive enforcement and civil oversight, competing with other criminal enterprises that did not share his organization's traditions or vulnerabilities. When federal complaints in the 2010s described Bellomo as the head of the Genovese family, they were nomming a man at the top of a hierarchy that was still dangerous, but no longer systemically dominant. This does not mean that the problem he represents has been solved. Extortion, labor corruption, illicit gambling, and financial crimes continue in various forms, carried out by a mix of old-line mafia figures and newer, more fluid networks. But the historical weight of the Genovese family, and of leaders like Bellomo, has helped shape the tools now used to confront such activity. His prosecutions contributed to the normalization of complex racketeering cases, to the practice of flipping insiders who once swore never to cooperate, and to the expectation that industries long considered mobbed up could in fact be reclaimed by legitimate governance. For now, the final chapters of his life remain unwritten in any public sense. He is, as far as available information indicates, still living, an aging man whose name carries a particular resonance in law enforcement files and in the specialized literature on American organized crime, but who is largely invisible to the broader public. There are no authorized biographies, no self-justifying memoirs, no filmed confessions or reconciliations. What exists is a trail through official documents that begins with a birth date in 1957 and runs through decades of investigative attention, criminal charges, admitted conduct, and punishment. That trail is enough to fix his place in the history of the American mafia. It shows that he rose from a specific set of social and economic circumstances, post-war immigrant New York, with its dense ethnic enclaves and informal power structures, into a leadership role in one of the country's most entrenched criminal enterprises. It shows that he used that position, as he ultimately acknowledged in court, to oversee and profit from schemes that harmed workers, businesses, and public institutions. It shows that the state, in response, deployed some of its most sophisticated legal and investigative tools to limit his power, resulting in substantial prison sentences and helping to drive reforms in the sectors he and his associates exploited. Beyond those core facts, much about his inner life and current activities will likely remain opaque, both because he has chosen not to speak publicly and because the world he inhabited was built on the careful control of information. For a historian or documentarian, that opacity is not entirely a deficiency. It offers a reminder that even the most scrutinized figures in the underworld are not wholly knowable, and that any attempt to tell their story must distinguish clearly between what is proven, what is alleged, and what is, at best, informed speculation. In the end, Liborio Bellomo's life can be seen as a thread woven through several large narratives: the rise and partial fall of the traditional Italian-American mafia, the transformation of federal law enforcement in response to organized crime, the changing fortunes of New York's working-class neighborhoods, and the evolving debates about responsibility, identity, and justice in a democratic society. His story does not offer tidy moral closure or dramatic redemption. It offers, instead, a densely documented case of how individual choices, made within a particular historical and social context, can reverberate outward, reshaping not only the criminal networks that nurtured them, but also the laws, institutions, and communities that eventually rose to meet them.